everybody, and welcome to another hair-raising, fun-filled, expeditious episode of Radiorama, where as the name implies, I show you how to work on radios. You never know what's going to come across the workbench, but um, we have a 1949 Philco 504 model Transitone, and I've worked on exactly 50 billion of these sets. They were very, very common. They were popular because they were usually priced at the $20 range, and Philco was kind of like the price champion when it came to making, you know, pretty good radios at a lower price. I think later brands like Admiral wound up being like even cheaper. But um, a lot of radios in the 20s and 30s, they'd have a power transformer or you had a bunch of batteries. And when the power transformers came along, that eliminated a lot of the batteries. But transformers are also kind of expensive as they're complicated and difficult to make. And starting in the 30s, Philco and a few others decided to make something called a hot chassis design or a floating chassis design. So all of the tubes get strung together. Their voltages add up to 110 volts. And one end of the line goes to chassis, usually through a capacitor, but some of the more dangerous designs directly to chassis. And the Transitone line was, I forget what the nickname for these were. They were kind of like the poor man's radio. I'm not sure why they called them that, but they were reasonably priced, well engineered, well performing radios. And Philco was along for a pretty long time. They only really kind of ceased to really exist after their whole fiasco with the Philco predicted television sets, which were beautiful to look at but really unreliable. And a Ford Motor Company bought them because they wanted their aerospace. And the Philco brand is still around, but it is a South American brand. Well, it's sold in South America under Philco. With that said, let's go ahead and test this radio. A power transformer set I tend to bring up on a Variac. I'm not so much as concerned about the non-transformer set. So immediately we see that the pilot light is coming up, and I am prepared to turn it off in case it does what about 50% of these radios will do, which is they will hum. Okay, the filter caps have gone completely bad. Don't power a radio with filter caps like that because you can cause some damage. I'm not surprised. I would not be at all surprised if this is a 100% factory original set and it's just been put away for a long time. But whoever had it took really nice care of it because most of the time these backs are gone. And all that's left is the antenna here because the backs would get damaged or people would replace the tubes and lost the little clips or they didn't feel like putting it back on or whatever. Most of these I get do not have a back, and this one's in really good shape, so that's an extra bonus. Here is the back removed, and it's very clean, probably because that back was still present. And I don't think it's ever been worked on because in order to work on the chassis, you have to unsolder these two leads, and usually people solder them on kind of sloppily. That looks factory. It's interesting that all the tubes in it are also Philco tubes. That's the rectifier. And usually if you see a rectifier tube that's been used excessively, you'll have a little bit of kind of like burning in the top area, but I don't see that. The rest of these tubes are Loctol tubes. That was a Philco invention, and albeit a not very wonderful invention because the pins on these are a lot smaller, and so there's just much more opportunity to have bad connections or dirty connections. So a lot of times these guys just won't work right because the sockets are dirty or the pins on the tubes need to be scraped. Got a pretty nice big speaker in there. This will probably sound pretty good. So I'm going to desolder these two. Usually I'll do is I get a marker and I'll mark which one is which. Like I'll mark it red and then paint that red or whatever. And that when I put it back together again, I know what goes where. Okay, so I removed it out of here, and even the paper for the backlight here is perfect. Someone took really good care of this thing. Let's take a look underneath here. And It's all factory original. No one's been in this thing. This is probably the first time this has seen light since 1949. And we have our filter caps, which are there's probably two in there. And then we have a bunch of little paper capacitors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Not much going on here. This is the most critical right here. You see this capacitor? It says 0.2 of a microfarad. Well, that's going to chassis ground. And so that's the floating ground here. And that value is so high that if you were to, say, I don't know, be in your bare feet on a concrete floor and you touched the chassis, probably wouldn't kill you, but it wouldn't feel great either. You definitely would get a nice sharp tingle for sure. So that needs to be replaced. Actually, I'm looking at this capacitor. There's 3 values in here. I've never seen one where the negative and a positive comes out of one end. That's weird. I'm assuming this must be the ground because it's a black wire, and also it's going to the grounding cap here. So usually, especially with the bigger brands, you'll see the values for each color-coded wire. So we've got what looks like probably what used to be a yellow and a green and a orange or red. And so when I take this out, I'll be able to read the values and replace with the appropriates. I don't recall seeing solar brand capacitors in Philcos. That said, it just looks factory. Like this is really good soldering. It doesn't look like it's disturbed. Usually when you replace something, you can tell. Well, I think it's factory. They must made of maybe there was a special on solar brand capacitors. Anyway, it's 50, 30, and 20 microfarads at 150 volts. I don't have any 20 microfarads at 150 volts. So I'm just going to put 47 microfarads across the line. It's not going to hurt anything. In fact, it'll probably make it sound even a little bit better because it's going to filter even more. So I'm going to replace these first, and then we'll test it to see if that restores functionality, which I think it probably will, even though I'm prepared to eat my words, because I've done that repeatedly when I come across a set where I'm like, this is like easier than stealing candy from a baby. I'll have this up in no time, and then it stumps me. Some of the most simple sets stump me worse than anything. So they got the 3 electrolytics replaced, and their positives were all like real close to each other, so I just ran a common negative for all 3 of them. I think I remember working on these before. They're pretty easy. So what I'm going to do now is bring it up and see if that restores our problems with humming, which it should, because that's all the electrolytics now. Got it connected to the antenna temporarily with some alligator clips. And again, we don't have the safety cap replaced yet, so just be aware of that. That doesn't sound good. I think it's a connection issue. I've noticed that these skinny little wires, you just about have to solder them back on to make sure it works. Alright, so that was it. I just needed to solder it on there. Got a lot of dirt in the volume control. Yeah, it works. But we need to clean some contacts. That's the weird channel I listen to from Tennessee. It's interesting. The part of the world that I grew up in was near the Smoky Mountains, and there was a heavy Scotch-Irish influence there, so some of the music and the singing styles are reminiscent of the British Isles, and so that is probably comes from some sort of Elizabethan song. I don't know. I'm not a music major. All right, so we've got all the capacitors replaced, including the oh so important across the line safety cap. And I measured some of these caps, and they do not measure good at all. ESR and the capacitance are way, 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 way off. So I'm anticipating that maybe there'll be some improvement in performance, but we'll find out real shortly. What I want to do is clean out the volume control because it was definitely kind of scratchy. So shoot it full of juice. Twirl it around a little bit. So let me get the cabinet back up here. We'll hook up the antenna and see if there's any improvement in the quality of the radio. Okay, let's test it again, and there is a possibility that this thing's going to squeal like crazy because we've taken a 0.2 of a microfarad grounding cap out and replaced it with a 0.01 rated cap. But we'll see. Sometimes you just have to add maybe one or two more of those.
I was at North Main Street, and I got a call from Joyce on the KCBS phone portion.
Trip to Lambeau Field. Finally have a win. They came.
The station was day low for Apple Music. It's confronting the climate crisis.
Well, works pretty well. Good. That probably means it's also going to be safe as far as the amount of current getting to the chassis. Okay, next thing I need to do is check to see if it's going to pass our safety requirements. And what we do is we put our multimeter on the 2 volts AC setting. And we've made this little box here. The output is 250 millivolts AC. And our max rating on that scale is 0.6. That's the maximum that's the max we are allowing these sets to pass with. So I'm going to touch the chassis here. 0.062. Wow, just barely passes under our strict guidelines. Let's try the other reversed polarity, see what that does. 0.03. All right, so it does pass. That's good. What that means is that if someone were to, say, for some reason touch the chassis, which is not easy because it's got a back, and ground at the same time, they might get a little bit of a tingle. I wouldn't recommend anyone do that, but it's essentially, we aim for putting our sets with current that is below the level of current that would take a heart to fibrillate. And so that's why we did this. Next up, I'm going to replace the cord. The one on it is okay. Like if this were mine, unless I planned on using it really, really regularly, which most of my sets I don't. They're shelf queens, admittedly. Then, you know, this needs to be replaced because you see that, how it's cracking? I mean, for 1949 rubber, it's still pretty impressive. It's pretty much safe now, but you have no idea how long someone's going to continue using these sets. Like, what if the sets get used for another 20, 30 years? That's just going to deteriorate even worse. So I'm going to replace it with a new cord. Anytime I'm driving around, there's like crap on the side of the road, like an appliance or whatever, I cut the cord off because cords ain't cheap anymore. So I'll need to take this grommet off. And it's important that you want to use the same gauge so that it'll fit the grommet when you put it back in. If you get something fatter, you're not going to be able to squish it in there. And this is a polarized plug. As such, I want to make sure that I do it properly because otherwise what will happen is that when you turn it on, if it's on the wrong side, it could cause the set to make noise. So you want it on the neutral side, and I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. All right, so here's how you determine if you installed a polarized plug properly. With the set off, we should be seeing 120 volts. If I measure from ground to chassis, and I see it's 117 volts. So when we turn it on, then we should see 0. Yeah, half a volt. So that means that I guessed correctly. The way I have it configured now is in the neutral setting. So I'm just going to solder these in just like that. And the next thing we're going to do is add a audio input feature so that whoever buys this from our little museum can listen to their music and radio. Next up, we have the cord installed. I'm going to install the audio input feature. This is a floating chassis set, and even though we've kind of neutralized it, we're going to add an extra layer of safety, which is to make sure that if anything comes through the audio cable that's going to go through this, that it'll be essentially stopped. This is will isolate the person from any sort of current. But what we need to do is make sure that we have the ability to turn the IF/radio signal on and off so that the audio is unhindered. And this one's really easy. This is going up to that IF transformer. And the other side, we can trace it, and it's going to the ground here for that cap. So this is the top of the volume control, and this is where we want our positive audio signal to go, and the negative will go here or there, depending on how easy it is to solder. And what I want to do is actually, I think I'm going to do is drill a hole here for the audio line, because this is the rectifier and output stage, and this is all the the receptions type tubes, and I want to keep our audio line as far away from that as possible so that it doesn't create any interference on radio. We'll have a little switch that comes out so we can switch this IF signal on and off. You want to keep that lead as short as possible, again, for preventing any sort of interference with your radio reception, because we want this to work well on AM just as well as it's going to work with the incoming audio signal. So I'll wire this up. We're going to probably install this transformer there. It's real close. You want to keep everything as close as possible. And I'm going to use an audio cable, a 3.5 millimeter stereo cable, and we'll tie the right and left channels together through a set of resistors so that we get mono. It's not going to be stereo ever because it's a mono unit. But we can at least capture most of the features of audio by putting the channels together. Alright, so we have our isolation transformer, our audio cable running in through a rubber grommet, and then we have it running through a set of resistors that puts the right and left channels together. We have our switch cable coming out the back of this existing hole, and we have a Bluetooth signal running through right now. Oh, I'm already tired of the Christmas music. I tell you, when I was in high school, I worked at a Lowe's, which in the U.S. is a home improvement store, and they put me in Inside Lawn and Garden. And Inside Lawn and Garden in Tennessee, in the winter, it's not going to sell a lot of garden stuff because it's cold outside. So they turned that into the Christmas department, and so I was surrounded by mid-90s era awful smoke alarm sounding digital singing Christmas decorations. They had this, I don't know, I remember there was this one aisle that had a whole bunch of motion sensor activated snowmen that when you walked by them, if they were turned on, they'd all say in unison, say, "Oh, ho, ho, Merry Christmas," except it was a weird shadow effect where people would walk by and they wouldn't all go off at the same time. I'm not sure why I'm telling you these things. I just remember for years I was so sick of Christmas music, and I've gotten back into it, but still, I remember that awful year that I worked in the Christmas department, which is funny because now I love Christmas lights, and I got them all over my house. In fact, I've got a tree over there, and those lights will be turning on soon. But the music, I can only take it in doses. All right, so I was about to say this is done, but there's one more thing I need to do to this chassis before it's electrically, well, in this case, mechanically restored. We want to make sure that all of the tuning surfaces turn easily. So there's some bearings in the front of the tuning condenser. I'm going to hit it with a little zoom spout oil. That and the back and the center. And then what we want to do is also get all of the pulleys. And you want to be careful not to get any on the string. I do that very gingerly. And then likewise we want to get the tuning shaft. So we'll put a little here. And what I also do is like get a little on my finger and do where the thing slides here. That's already turning a lot easier. Likewise, we want to put just a little bit on the volume control shaft. This makes it turn a lot easier. Yeah, see, it's little tactile things like that make all the difference. So I'm going to work that in real well, and then it's going to be time to start on the not the chassis, the cabinet, which is in very nice shape. I think this will clean up very, very well. An important thing about Bakelite is the shine comes from the mold it came out of, and it's a very, very thin surface. So if you see something like this, do not take it over to the sink and clean it. Don't do that. Especially harsh chemicals will strip that casting right off, and it'll be dull forever. So I'm not going to clean it. I'm going to use a cleaner Caranuba wax, a plant-based wax that does a great job of bringing back the luster of Bakelite, even though this is pretty shiny. But I think we can make it even shinier. All right, I'm going to use some Caranuba car wax. I have an affinity for Meguiar's. Stuff's been around forever. And it's cheaper too. But I use it on my cars too, so. And I have a 27-year-old truck that still looks pretty good, so it does a good job. So like I said, don't use cleaners on these Bakelite sets, especially when they're in this nice a condition. And I'm going to use one of my old socks to apply the wax. This sometimes takes longer than actually restoring the electronics, but we'll see.